Now that we also migrated the welcome component, it's time to finally migrate the app component as well though, because this will then also allow us to get rid of this entire app module. So therefore we should go to the app component and there also add standalone and set this to true. Now in there, I want to use the app welcome or the welcome component. So therefore we should add imports as you learned it and import the welcome component and also add an import to the file here. Now with that, it will fail though, because the app component is of course an important component. Yes, we would have to remove it from app declarations, but if I now add app component here to imports, it will still fail, because as mentioned, it is a key component, it's the root component. If we want to migrate the root component of our application and turn it into a standalone component, we also have to change our bootstrapping code in main.ts. Instead of bootstrapping with a module, we now want to bootstrap a component, and just a component, because we just have a component now. We don't have a module anymore. I mean, we have one here, but we don't need it anymore because the root component is standalone, and the idea behind standalone components is that they work without modules. Therefore, in main.ts, we now bootstrap the application not with this code. We can get rid of that, therefore. Instead, we call a bootstrap application function, which is imported from @angular/platform browser. We import that, we import this function, and to bootstrap application, we pass a pointer at our root component. So in this case, app component. I'm importing app component from app component, and I'm pointing at it here. I'm passing this, a pointer at this class, to the bootstrap application function. And with this, if we save that, our application works again. I also got no error here, the service still works, the directive obviously still works, and now we migrated everything to standalone components, including the root component, which now must be bootstrapped with help of this function, which takes that single standalone component instead of an entire module. This also means that we can get rid of app module now, of this entire file. Because this browser module, which was imported, is made available by Bootstrap application anyways. It's made available by default, so we don't need to take care about that. And other than that, we only had imports here, and we don't need that anymore. So now we can get rid of app module, and that was our goal in the end, and that is the biggest benefit we can get out of standalone components. Because now I got rid of both modules which I had in this application at the beginning, and we therefore now have less boilerplate and leaner code. And if I save this, the app of course still works. Now of course we did have to add all these standalone flags and these imports properties, but it is possible that maybe in some future standalone components will be the default, and therefore this flag doesn't have to be added anymore, because in the future maybe true is the default here, and hence this can be omitted. But right now that's not the case yet. But then we would have less boilerplate code. And regarding imports, chances are that this is never going to disappear, but of course it's still less code to write and less boilerplate than you have with all those modules, especially in bigger applications where your modules can get very complex. So this is now this app migrated to standalone components and standalone directives. As a next step, let's take a closer look at services with standalone components before we then take a look at routing and lazy loading. Now I want to take a brief look at services with standalone components. I do have one service in this demo app, and it is a service as you would always define it. It's a class decorated with @injectable, where I provide an object with the provided in-property set to root. This in the end makes sure that this service is provided to all components of your application. All your components and directives can inject this service, and all those components and directives will operate on the same object based on that service. Now this works just fine with standalone components, as you can clearly tell, because no adjustments were needed here. However, you might recall that this is not the only way of providing services. Instead of doing it like this, which is the recommended way typically though, you could have also added this service to the providers array of a module, and that would have been fine as well, and it would have also made that service available to all components and directives, and it would have made available a single object of that service. What you can also do, and what you could do before standalone components as well, is you can go to a component and add the providers property to this component's decorator object. And again, this is not new, you could do this with Angular 2 already. And then you can also add your analytics service here. Add an import to the file and then point at the class here. And if you save this, you will notice that this still works as before. So that's another way of providing services. Now the difference is that if you add a service to a component like this, every component gets its own object. So if you use the same service for multiple instances of a component, you get multiple instances of that service as well, and there is no shared state. Sometimes that's needed, often it's not, therefore you rarely do that. This behavior is not new though, it always worked like this. I just wanted to mention again that you can still use it even if you are using standalone components. Now if still, for whatever reason, you don't want to provide a service globally by adding provided in here, you can also bring back the old feature of adding it to a providers array. Previously, you added the ng module with a providers object, which was an array of services. Now, in such an application that doesn't have modules, you can go to the Bootstrap application function here and add a second object, which allows you to provide some configuration. At the moment, there's only one property you can set though, and that's the providers property. And here you can do exactly what you would imagine. You can add your globally provided services here as well. So here I can also add my analytics service like this. Add an import to the file, add the class here, make sure you don't have providers in the details component anymore, and still with this kind of code, you will see that if I open this, my service still works. So this is the equivalent of having a providers array in an ng module. If you want to provide some service globally, you can add it here with this second argument that's passed to Bootstrap application. Now here, this is really not needed, therefore I'll comment this out actually. You could do this, but it's not needed, because here the best way of providing this service is to add this provided in syntax. Still, I wanted to mention it because it is important to understand how you can work with services and standalone components. Now with all those basics about standalone components out of the way, let's move one step further and let's take a look at standalone components combined with routing, because of course in many Angular applications you also need routing. For this, attached you find an updated starting project, which is the same project as before, with all those components migrated to standalone components, at least the components we worked on thus far, but we got some new components in there as well. We got an about component, which renders a simple dummy about page, and a dashboard component, which renders a dummy page, which also has another router link in there, because there we can navigate to this today component, which is another dummy page. Now what's interesting here is that the dashboard components have their own module, where I'm specifically declaring the dashboard component and then the dashboard routing module, and the dashboard routing module is responsible for navigating between dashboard and this today component, and it's worth noting that they are provided with the forChild method, making them lazy loadable. Because that's the idea. I have this dashboard routing module, and the module and its routes should be loaded lazily when they're needed by the app routing module. This is also new, another new file I added to this starting project. And in this app routing module, I am defining some routes the root route to the welcome component, the about route to the about component, and then the dashboard route, which loads this dashboard routing module lazily. So that module I just showed you is loaded lazily here. And again, this is all default Angular code. That is what you already know. That's nothing special. But this also won't work like this, because at the moment this app routing module is not wired up because we have no app module. We removed that app module after all. Therefore, if you ng-serve this, if you start the development server here, you will notice that this fails because in the app component template here, I'm using the router outlet, but this won't work anymore because the app component is a standalone component and does not know what to do with that router outlet, and it also doesn't know about these routes. So therefore, that's what we'll have to fix here. Now, as a first step to fix this, we have to make the app component aware of the router module that's built into Angular, so that it knows the router outlet, but also the router link directive. Because router link and router outlet are things totally unknown to Angular if you're not making the router module available. And right now the app component doesn't know about it because it's standalone. So just because we have an ng module here where we are defining the router module does not tell the app component about it. Instead, just as with our own custom component, we have to import the router module here. We have to add it to imports here in our app component and also add the import here at the top of our file. With that, this error is gone, but now we don't see anything on the screen. The reason for that is that Angular now does know about the router outlet. It does now understand this, and it does understand router link, but it's not aware of those routes yet. Now, to make Angular aware of these routes, we have to go to main.ts, where we bootstrap the application, and here we basically have to add our routing module to providers. Now, the routing module is not a service, but for root actually acts as a service. Now, to make the app routing module work here in main.ts, we have to import a special helper function provided by Angular Core, and that's the import providers from function. We have to add this here to our providers array on Bootstrap application, and it's a function, so we execute it. And then to import providers from, we add a pointer at app routing module, like this. So we have to import app routing module from this app routing module file, and then we point at it here. We pass a pointer at this routing module class to import providers from. And this in the end makes our standalone root component aware of our routes and makes the overall Angular application aware of our routes, so to say. If we save this now, our welcome page is back, but we can now also navigate to the about page or the dashboard page. And it's worth noting, if we reload the application on the home page and we open the network tab in our browser DevTools, that this dashboard page is loaded lazily. If you watch the HTTP requests here, you'll notice that if I click on dashboard, the code for this component is only downloaded when it's needed. So lazy loading works just fine here, and it's also worth noting that all of that works in an application, in an Angular app where many components, including the root component, are actually standalone components. So app component is a standalone component, and nonetheless, by connecting our routing setup like this, we are able to use routing with our app routing module and with a couple of components that are not standalone components at all. Dashboard, today, and about are not standalone components. Instead, they are registered in a different module and in a different routing module, and everything works just fine. So again, you can blend modules with this standalone approach also when using routing. But you can also choose a different approach, turn those components into standalone components as well, and then also adjust the routing code accordingly.